Welcome to First Sleep Aid, calm stories to help you unwind, learn, and fall asleep. From true crime to curious facts and thoughtful ideas, always softly spoken. Subscribe now and take a deep breath. You're in good hands. There's a unique kind of stillness that settles in right after applause dies down.
Hmm.
It's more than just quiet. It feels like anticipation hanging in the air, doesn't it? Waiting for what comes next.
Absolutely. And in the story we're exploring today, those silences, they often held the real weight, the real narrative.
It's fascinating how deliberate those moments were, even the visual of it all.
Exactly. Picture the scene. Just one person on stage, no podium, just the absolute
The
essentials.
uniform, right? Jeans, sneakers, that black turtleneck, iconic now.
And just that little clicker in his hand, orchestrating everything.
Yeah. And the crowd, it wasn't just quiet attention, it felt like reverence almost.
Like they weren't just watching a CEO.
No, they
Right.
were seeing someone who seemed to have this connection to the future, like a high priest of tech or maybe a magician.
And it really went beyond just marketing, didn't it? It
Yeah,
felt like he
yeah.
was genuinely revealing something.
Unveiling it.
Yeah, unveiling something that felt inevitable. Like the technology was just waiting to be shown. These weren't just gadgets. They felt like, well, miracles, one after another.
And that connection he built, it wasn't just about function, about what the device could do.
Bro, it was deeper.
It was about how it made you feel more elegant, maybe, more connected, even somehow more like yourself.
But it's so important to understand this powerful story, this image, it didn't just spring up overnight.
Right. The story we're really diving into today, it doesn't kick off with Apple or the iPhone or even that famous one more thing.
No, the roots go much, much deeper.
Our journey actually starts somewhere much more intimate. A hospital room. A young woman making an incredibly difficult choice.
And it travels to, well, a pretty unassuming place, a garage. The kind of unlikely spot where a partnership started that nobody saw coming.
And fundamentally, it all starts inside the mind of someone who saw the world just a little differently.
That feeling of being an outsider, it fueled this incredible drive, didn't it? For innovation, for perfection, almost an obsession.
And it built a legacy that, well, it's still shaping our world right now.
What's striking is that his genius wasn't in, say, inventing the computer itself.
No, he wasn't the coder, not the engineer in the traditional sense.
His real brilliance was as a storyteller, using machines, really, as his way to reshape how we see ourselves.
He built possibility, took this abstract thing, technology, and made it feel tangible, relatable, like looking in a mirror sometimes.
But it's a complex story,
Mm.
always, for all the beauty he brought into the world.
He wasn't easy.
No, not warm, not approachable. Brilliance and, well, a kind of cruelty could exist side by side. Often did.
So this deep dive, it's not about simply praising him or tearing him down.
No, it's really a quest to understand the person behind the myth, the adopted kid, the obsessive visionary, the volatile leader, the man who really redefined how we see ourselves through technology.
We want to unpack what he gave us, what he took maybe, and what he left behind, not just in our phones and computers.
But woven into how we live now, the modern soul, you could say.
So what's the human code underneath it all? Beneath the brand, beneath the legend.
That's the core question, isn't it? That's what we're exploring.
And the narrative really begins not with tech, but with a deeply personal event. A child being given away.
He was born February 24th, 1955, San Francisco. But the circumstances were complicated from the start.
His mother, Joanne Shebol, was young, unmarried, Catholic. The father, Abdulfatah Jandali, a Muslim grad student from Syria,
And their families, well, they strongly opposed the relationship.
which led to that incredibly difficult decision putting the baby up for adoption,
She was born unnamed, just a date, a wait, a
Yeah.
blank slate in a way.
and then adopted by Paul and Clara Jobs. Working class couple, no college degrees, but crucially, they were determined to love him.
There's that detail, isn't there? Joanne initially wanted college graduates.
Yeah, she hesitated, but Paul Jobs, the mechanic, he convinced her. His practicality, maybe his sincerity.
And so the baby becomes Stephen Paul Jobs, deeply loved by Paul and Clara.
But that early story, it lingered.
Absolutely. He talked about it later, that duality. I was chosen. I was special. You can hear the pride.
But then the flip side, I always felt I was rejected before I was accepted. That tension seems key.
It really became a central driving force in his whole life, that paradox.
Even as a kid, you saw signs of it. Bright, restless, incredibly sharp, but bored easily by structure.
Yeah, the school stories, pranks, suspensions, clashing with teachers. It wasn't just being naughty, maybe.
More like a mind pushing against boundaries.
Exactly. But when something interested him, the focus was, well, intense, laser-like.
There's that poignant story about telling a classmate he was adopted.
And the kid asks, crying, "So your real parents didn't want you?" Devastating for a child.
And his parents trying to reassure him, "You're special. We chose you."
Comforting words, surely. But Jobs himself said deep down, a splinter stayed lodged.
It's important to frame this right. This wasn't poverty or abuse in the usual sense.
No, not hardship like that, but it created this deep internal need.
A need to be irreplaceable.
I think so. To create something so beautiful, so perfect, that the world couldn't possibly give him away again.
And you see that drive playing out for decades, crafting these devices that felt necessary.
That demand for perfection may be rooted in that fear of rejection.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
And the obsession with control over his world.
Stemming from that lack of control over his own beginning. It fits. His story started with abandonment, so everything that followed had to feel indispensable.
He wasn't really a rebel in the classic sense, was he? More like a misfit who just wasn't interested in playing games he didn't design himself.
Right. And growing up, where and when he did Silicon Valley in the 60s, that was a unique environment.
You had engineers tinkering in garages right alongside hippies, exploring consciousness in fields, semiconductors and LSD coexisting.
He grew up right in that split, didn't he? Precision engineering on one side, counterculture on the other.
And you see it in his high school years. Building circuits, but also skipping class,
Yeah.
reading Shakespeare and Zen Buddhism.
Soldering kits and, well, psychedelics. It was a real mix.
His grades were apparently pretty average.
Because his focus was so selective.
Right.
Laser beam on what interested him, everything else just noise.
And then he meets Steve Wozniak.
Was. Brilliant, shy, incredibly patient with electronics. A pure engineer.
And Jobs. Intense, visionary, apparently kind of rude even back then.
But he saw the human shape in the machines, didn't he? Was saw the circuits. Jobs saw what they could mean.
That partnership started early with the blue box, making free phone calls, bending reality a bit.
Jobs said was the first person I met who knew more than the teacher. That's recognition, not just praise.
Outside of school, he was just devouring ideas, wasn't he? Autobiography of a yogi, fasting silence.
Riding his bike barefoot, searching for something.
He seemed to believe that beauty and truth could be engineered, like you could get to them by stripping everything non-essential away.
It wasn't really religion in a conventional way, though. More like achieving control through aesthetic purity.
Dreaming of perfect design, not necessarily searching for God.
Then came Reed College. Drops out after one semester in 1974.
But sticks around, auditing classes, and crucially, calligraphy.
Seems random, right? But he talked about learning about typefaces, spacing, elegance in print.
He said it was beautiful, historical, artistically subtle in a way that science can't capture.
And years later, that directly influenced the first Mac, having multiple fonts. Amazing connection.
Then the wanderer phase continues travels to India, seeking spiritual answers.
Comes back thinner, maybe dirtier, but more certain than ever that he had to build something extraordinary. The what was still fuzzy, though.
Already demanding, difficult, different.
But underneath all that seeming chaos, there was this mind working relentlessly to merge meaning and machine.
You really can't tell the Apple story without focusing on the dynamic between Jobs and Wozniak.
Absolutely not. It started with, well, mischief, grew into this crucial partnership, and ultimately led to Apple itself.
Steve Wozniak, you described him as shy, steady, non-competitive, the pure engineer.
Yeah, he loved making things work beautifully, had this amazing gift for electronics, could build circuits from memory, simplify really complex systems.
And his impulse was to share, right, not necessarily to sell.
Completely. Jobs was the opposite in that sense. He didn't care so much about the wires inside.
He cared about what they could do, how they felt, how they looked, what they meant for people who weren't techies.
They met through a friend. Was 5 years older, Jobs still in high school.
But an instant connection.
Seems so. Both loved pranks, puzzles. Both felt a bit misunderstood, maybe, but definitely didn't want to be invisible.
Their first big collaboration was that blue box, was designed it.
And Jobs sold it. More for the thrill, the challenge, than the money, apparently.
Jobs even said later, if we hadn't made blue boxes, there would have been no Apple.
It taught them something crucial, didn't it? That a couple of smart guys could actually hack the big systems. That the future belonged to the clever ones.
Then, 1976 creates this breakthrough, a fully functional personal computer on just one single board.
An engineering marvel. But Jobs immediately saw something else.
He saw a product, a way to bring computing out of the labs and into people's homes.
Saw the elegant logic. Jobs saw revolution. And right there, Apple was born.
Started incredibly small. Jobs convinced to sell his prized calculator.
Jobs sold his VW van, raised about $1,300.
And the first units, famously, built in Jobs' parents' garage. That's where the myth really takes hold.
It wasn't magic, though. It was wires, wood, and sheer willpower.
Jobs was already hustling, convinced the owner of the bite shop to buy 50 assembled units.
That was a huge leap of faith for the store owner.
And Jobs got credit from suppliers before Apple was even really a company. That reality distortion field already at work, maybe? Manifesting things?
By the time most people even realized what was happening, they were already building the future, not just because they had a plan, but because they had each other.
Let's talk about that garage. The myth versus the reality. It wasn't really the factory floor, was it?
No, not in the production sense. But it became this symbolic altar. What they really built there was belief, not just hardware.
1976, Los Altos, California. Paul and Clara Jobs' house on Christ Drive. Just a normal suburban home, clean garage.
And it somehow became the most famous garage in American business history.
But the truth is, no computers were really manufactured there in bulk.
Right. It was the workshop, the planning room, and crucially, it became an image that Jobs later very carefully curated.
Even back then, he understood that the story, the myth, really matters.
The Apple I itself was pretty primitive by today's standards. Just a bare motherboard.
No keyboard, no case, no monitor included. Really for hobbyists, built by woes.
Sold by Jobs. They sold about 200 units. Enough to know they were onto something real.
But that wasn't enough for Jobs, was it? He didn't just want the hobbyists, the fringe.
He wanted everyone. He had this vision where the machine itself almost disappears so the idea can shine through.
And that's where the aesthetic vision comes in, right at the beginning.
Absolutely. Jobs was already obsessed with form, packaging, how things felt to touch and use.
He wasn't just selling a computer, he was inventing an entire experience.
And he convinced him they needed to build something that, well, normal people could actually use.
No command lines, no massive manuals. Simplicity, elegance, maybe even joy.
Computing is art. That was a radical idea back then.
Computers were mostly gray boxes in labs. Jobs wanted them in homes, schools, but they had to be beautiful.
His vision was clear in his head, even if it was hard to explain sometimes. It wasn't just, what does it do?
It was, how does it make you feel? That became the guiding principle.
So the garage might not have built the mass-produced machines.
But it set the tone. Purity, control, narrative.
And Jobs spent his life refining that story that started there. Editing it, distilling it, telling it until everyone, including himself, believed it utterly.
And it worked. Apple became more than a company. It was this creation myth wrapped in fiberglass and philosophy. The world was starting to listen.
Simplicity for Jobs wasn't just about fewer buttons. It was deeper. It was about removing reasons for doubt, cutting out distractions, making space for awe, maybe?
Even when he was young, he apparently couldn't stand clutter. Messy rooms, wordy explanations, cluttered design, it all bothered him intensely.
Yeah, there's stories of him walking into meetings, seeing something messy, and just shutting it down. That's too messy. Start over.
It wasn't just about style then. It was a core belief.
A pursuit of purity, I think. A rejection of anything distracting. And it led to this obsession with end-to-end control.
Everything. How it worked, looked, felt. How the box opened, how the screen glowed.
He wanted touching the product to feel inevitable, like it had always existed, just waiting for you.
And he was ruthless about it. Famously redesigned the Mac's internal circuit board because it looked ugly.
Not because it didn't work, just because it wasn't beautiful inside, even though nobody would see it.
For him, beauty wasn't just decoration. It was almost moral.
You see it in his study of calligraphy, typography, obsessing over tiny details like kerning.
Arguing over shades of gray, the curve of a corner, the click of a trackpad.
Pushing everyone past exhaustion. Real artistship, he'd say.
But only when every single pixel was perfect by his standard.
His design philosophy boiled down to a few key things, didn't it?
Strip away everything unnecessary.
Hide the complexity from the user.
And let the user feel powerful without having to struggle.
The Mac, the iPod, the iPhone, they all kind of whispered, don't worry, just touch. We've thought of everything for you.
But that control, that vision,
it came at a cost. He could be brutal with colleagues.
Unforgiving with engineers, calling ideas shit, storming out of meetings, firing people seemingly on a whim.
Yet, the goal was always that almost spiritual simplicity.
Yeah, simplicity wasn't just aesthetics for him. It felt like his version of faith.
He believed a simple object could hold immense complexity, maybe like he himself felt chaotic, emotional, hungry for meaning, but longed to be seen as clear, pure, complete.
Apple, under him, wasn't just making products. It felt like this cathedral of control.
And simplicity was the stained glass projecting his vision onto the world and maybe back onto himself, too.
By 1980, just 4 years in, Apple was already this huge phenomenon.
The Apple II was the most successful personal computer out there. Schools, families, everyone seemed to want one.
The company exploded from just two guys in a garage to hundreds of employees, millions in revenue.
And then the IPO, the initial public offering. It was massive.
One of the biggest in American history at that point. Overnight, Steve Jobs, only 25 years old, was worth over $200 million.
And the spotlight just zoomed in on him, didn't it? Less on Wozniak or the engineers.
He became the face, gave interviews with this piercing confidence, talking about the future like he held the blueprint.
Said he was changing the world with this calm certainty. And people listened. They believed him.
But behind the scenes, things were getting tense. Brilliant, yes, but volatile. Inspiring, but impossible to work for sometimes.
Dismissing people, pitting teams against each other, micromanaging everything.
Declaring projects worthless one day, demanding they be redone in a week the next.
But he had that reality distortion field, right? That conviction that somehow made the impossible seem possible.
It wasn't delusion, exactly. It was this intense belief that bent reality around him, pushed people to do things they didn't think they could.
At the same time, he was pushing hard for the Macintosh. Beautiful, closed system, friendly, intuitive, his vision personified.
The Mac team said working for him was like being in a war zone led by a poet.
Wow. Made them do their best work, but broke them in the process.
The Mac launched in '84 with that revolutionary Super Bowl ad, the woman shattering the Big Brother screen.
The message was clear. Apple isn't just computers, it's a rebellion.
Jobs wasn't just a CEO anymore. He was a cultural force.
But darker clouds were gathering. The Mac was beautiful, but it was expensive.
Limited software, hard to manufacture efficiently, sales slowed down after the initial hype.
And inside Apple, executives started worrying. Jobs, powerful, famous, almost mythical now, was becoming harder and harder to manage.
The question started bubbling up behind closed doors. What if the man who built this amazing thing was now holding it back?
1984. The Macintosh launches. Thunderous applause. It looked amazing, sleek, iconic, personal.
It really felt like he'd done it again, changed the game completely in that first week.
But then, reality started to creep in. The Mac was, well, a bit underpowered initially.
It overheated because it had no fan. A classic Jobs design decision, prioritizing form over function, maybe.
The software available was thin, and that price tag, $2,495, was a fortune back then.
And worse, the IBM PC was taking off. Cheaper, more open, businesses loved it. The Mac didn't quite fit, and sales stalled.
Inside Apple, the mood shifted fast. Jobs became even more demanding, more erratic.
Calling team members bozos, mocking engineers, pushing decisions that didn't have broad support.
He split the company, didn't he? The Mac team were the elite pirates, the Apple II team, the new baby.
Playful on the surface, maybe, but it created this toxic division. An employee said it was like working for a king in exile. In favor one day, forgotten the next.
The board got seriously concerned. Profits were slipping, morale was crumbling, jobs seemed unmanageable, wouldn't listen.
He wanted the Mac to be perfect, but it wasn't making enough money. He demanded belief, but his team was burning out.
He expected Apple to follow him blindly, but the company started questioning if the visionary was driving them off a cliff.
Things peaked in 1985. John Scully, the CEO Jobs himself, had recruited from Pepsi, right? The adult supervision.
Scully confronted him. They clashed privately, then more publicly. Scully apparently didn't want to fire him initially.
Just move him out of the line of fire, maybe.
Uh-huh.
Remove him from operational control of the Mac division.
Jobs was offered a new role head of new development. No direct reports, no real control, polite exile.
He was furious. Tried to stage a boardroom coup to get Scully out. It failed.
He was officially removed from the Macintosh team. A few weeks later, he resigned from Apple altogether.
Just like that. At 30, the co-founder of this revolutionary company was forced out.
Packed his boxes, left quietly, drove away. Away from the company, the legend, and the machine that was so much a reflection of himself.
So 1985 in Cupertino, the Apple board is basically in quiet revolt, trying to contain their own creation.
Steve Jobs, co-founder, icon, myth maker, had become a problem in their eyes.
He'd alienated engineers, overspent massively on the Mac launch, refused to listen to anyone who disagreed.
Outsiders saw him as Apple's soul. Insiders saw him as a risk.
But the reality was, he was pushed out, exiled from the thing he'd poured his entire being into.
For Jobs, this had to be more than losing a job. It was like an identity crisis.
Everything he'd built, the mythology, the status, the control, stripped away.
And for someone who started life feeling discarded, this must have felt like a profound second abandonment, way beyond just a business setback.
Yet he didn't crumble, angry, bruised, yes, but already thinking ahead.
Years later, he famously said, "I didn't see it then, but getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have happened to me."
What followed was exile, and the slow, painful, but ultimately crucial reassembly of himself. Not a return, not yet.
They probably thought he was finished, out of the game. But in that exile, he started building the tools for his own resurrection.
Steve Jobs didn't just sit around licking his wounds. Within weeks of leaving Apple, he was already starting again.
Took about $12 million from his Apple stock sale and founded NextT.
The goal: to build the perfect computer for universities and scientific research.
Flawless design, massive power, artistic elegance. This was Jobs unleashed, without compromise.
He was just as demanding, hired brilliant engineers, bought expensive materials.
Insisted on that black magnesium case for the NextT computer. Beautiful, but incredibly hard to manufacture, almost sank the production.
Obsessed over every detail again.
Yeah.
The logo, the packaging, the startup sound.
And the result. The NextT computer. This stunning cube, admired by techies.
But very few could afford it, and even fewer actually needed it for their work.
It flopped commercially. Jobs, the former boy wonder, now looked a bit like a perfectionist adrift.
But even in that failure, he was planting seeds. That NextT operating system.
NextT step, way ahead of its time.
Exactly. It would eventually become the core of macOS and iOS. He didn't know it then, but NextT was the scaffolding for his future empire.
And then Pixar, 1986, bought a small computer graphics division from George Lucas.
Total investment around $10 million. Initially, he thought they'd sell high-end graphics hardware.
That didn't pan out either. He apparently considered shutting Pixar down multiple times.
But something held him back. Pixar wasn't just about machines. It was about storytelling.
That small group of animators, Ed Catmull, John Lasseter, they started creating something totally new. Computer-animated films.
Nobody had really done it successfully before. Jobs acted more like a patron, a funder, than the creative visionary at first. Kept them afloat.
For years, Pixar bled money, but something magical was taking shape.
Then, 1995, their first feature film, Toy Story.
An absolute phenomenon. Changed animation forever.
Heartfelt, beautiful, technologically groundbreaking. The first fully computer-animated movie.
Grossed hundreds of millions, made history, and yeah, made Jobs a billionaire again.
It proved he didn't need Apple to change the world. He could do it elsewhere.
So in exile, Steve Jobs had failed, succeeded, definitely grown, but hadn't really softened much.
Leaner, maybe more focused, still impatient, still exacting.
But maybe something had shifted. He learned, perhaps, that not everything could be controlled instantly. Totally.
Sometimes vision needs time to ripen, and that moment was coming. This time, Apple would come knocking on his door.
He came back almost through a side door, didn't he? Didn't knock it down, just sort of quietly rewrote the house from the inside.
By 1996, Apple was genuinely dying. Once revolutionary, now bordering on irrelevant. Losing money hand over fist, leadership in chaos.
The product line was bloated, confusing. The brand was unclear. They'd churned through CEOs, strategies. Nothing worked.
The world had moved on. Microsoft was king. Apple felt like a relic.
In desperation, Apple started looking to buy a new, modern operating system. Something stable, powerful.
And the unlikely target they landed on, NextT. Steve Jobs' failed startup had exactly what Apple lacked. That sleek, robust, Unix-based OS and, well, a vision.
Late 1996, Apple acquires NextT for $429 million.
And with that purchase came Steve Jobs. Technically just as an advisor, but nobody really believed it would stay that way.
He arrived quietly, sat in meetings, listened, watched. Didn't storm the castle.
No, he repopulated it, slowly, strategically. Started replacing people, dismantling teams, killing off those endless, confusing product lines.
When Apple's board finally fired the CEO, Gil Amelio, Jobs was the only logical choice left standing.
In 1997, he returned as interim CEO.
Yeah.
He was different now. Still sharp, still obsessive, but leaner, maybe wiser.
He brought this hard-on clarity, not just raw ideas.
Then he did something really unexpected early on. Made peace with Microsoft.
Macworld, 1997, announces a $150 million investment from Bill Gates. The crowd booed.
Loudly. But Jobs stayed calm. Said, we have to let go of the notion that for Apple to win, Microsoft has to lose.
Shocking at the time, but it signaled a new kind of leadership. Pragmatic, focused on reinvention, not revenge.
Then he slashed the product line. From dozens down to just 4. Consumer laptop and desktop, pro laptop and desktop.
Clarity, simplicity, focus, back to basics.
And then he started building, restructured engineering, streamlined the design process.
Put Joni Ive, that quiet British designer with minimalist genius, in charge of industrial design.
They became the axis of the new Apple, the Jobs-Ive partnership.
This wasn't just a recovery effort, it felt like a rebirth.
And as 1998 approached, something elegant, strange, colorful, something completely different was about to reintroduce Apple to the world.
He didn't just want you to use the product, he wanted you to want it desperately, before you even fully knew what it did. That was his magic.
1998, back on stage at the Flint Center in Cupertino. Slimmer, sharper, same black turtleneck, no tie, no apologies needed.
And the screen behind him just said, hello, again. That callback to 84, but feeling like resurrection, not nostalgia.
Then he unveiled the iMac, translucent, egg-shaped, that bold Bondi blue, all in one, no floppy drive, no beige, no apologies.
It looked like candy or sculpture or something from the future, clearly not for the spreadsheet crowd primarily.
Exactly. It was for everyone else. And Jobs didn't talk specs much. He talked emotion. He said, it looks like it came from another planet, and a good one.
The crowd laughed, but then they leaned in. Nobody had seen a computer sold like this as pure emotion, as desire.
The iMac sold like crazy.
Yeah.
Revived the brand, saved Apple financially, and culturally put them back on the map.
The computer became a fashion object, a statement piece you were proud to have on your desk.
Jobs knew. It's not about the megahertz. It's about desire.
Then, 2001, back on stage, introduces this tiny white box, 1,000 songs in your pocket.
The iPod. Not the first MP3 player, technically, but the first one that just felt right.
That click wheel was tactile genius. The body smooth, the software elegant.
And crucially, it worked seamlessly with iTunes, the ecosystem. A walled garden, maybe, but it felt like a gift at the time.
People lined up for blocks. The iPod became this huge cultural icon, white earbuds everywhere, billboards, TV shows.
Apple wasn't just tech anymore. It was a lifestyle brand, and Steve Jobs was its high priest.
He wasn't just selling devices, he was selling identity. Owning Apple meant you were choosing something. Creative, minimalist, ahead of the curve.
It meant seeing the world differently or wanting to.
Jobs famously said, design is not just what it looks like and feels like. Design is how it works.
And now design was also about how it made you feel.
The whole tech world started to shift. Technology, once cold and intimidating, started feeling intimate, inviting, even sexy because of him.
And he was really just getting started.
He turned product launches into pure theater, didn't he?
Yeah.
The stage became this place where technology felt like prophecy being delivered.
Absolutely. Lights go dark, that minimalist slide appears, the Apple logo glows softly.
Then the lone figure walks out. Jeans, sneakers, black turtleneck, no notes, doesn't thank sponsors, just starts talking.
That was Steve Jobs' stage. And everyone, press, fans, critics, competitors, everyone leaned in.
When Steve spoke, it wasn't just a presentation, it felt like a promise.
He totally redefined the product launch, made it a spectacle, not just a corporate chore.
Understood pacing, tension, surprise. He'd say, it's beautiful before you even saw it properly, and you'd already start believing him.
Use words like magical, revolutionary, insanely great, hyperbole, sure, but somehow it didn't feel cheap coming from him.
He wasn't just describing the product, he was describing the emotion he wanted you to feel about it.
He wasn't acting like a CEO, he was like a conductor of anticipation.
And then the masterstroke. One more thing, delivered so casually, right near the end.
A flourish, a secret shared. Not planned spontaneity, of course, but perfectly choreographed theater.
That phrase became legendary, triggered gasps, headlines, cheers.
Not just because of what it was, but how it made people feel. Like they were part of something special, something about to change everything again.
From the iPod, iMac, MacBook Air, pulled from that envelope.
Right, to the iPhone.
Oh.
He turned these keynotes into tech liturgy.
They became the benchmark. Other CEOs tried to copy him, but none could pull it off.
They didn't get what he was doing. Selling a product is one thing. Selling a future people desperately want to belong to. That's different.
He paced like a storyteller, clicked slides like punctuation, paused just right for the crowd to feel the weight of it.
His energy was controlled, sharp, like his mind was working faster than his words.
And it wasn't natural charisma alone. He rehearsed for weeks, micromanaged every visual, every camera angle, engineered perfection like everything else.
By the late 2000s, Apple keynotes were global events, live streamed, live blogged, like a rock concert or a movie premiere, somewhere between news and art. And at the center of it all, still thin, still intense, still absolute, Steve Jobs. More than a man now, unmistakably a myth.
The iPhone. It wasn't just another phone, was it? It felt like the start of a new posture, a new reflex, a whole new way of living.
Those famous words. Today, Apple's going to reinvent the phone. Simple, direct, audacious.
He teased the crowd first. An iPod, a phone, an internet communicator, repeated it.
Building the tension, then. These are not three separate devices. This is one device.
And boom, the iPhone. The crowd went wild. They felt it, even if they couldn't fully grasp the implications yet.
The world soon understood. This wasn't just a better phone. It felt like a new limb.
No buttons, just that screen. Touch, swipe, pinch, scroll. The interface just melted away.
The barrier between human and machine got incredibly thin. Jobs called it revolutionary. He wasn't wrong.
The iPhone collapsed so many categories into one device. Phone, camera, music player, web browser, GPS, email, clock, weather, wallet.
It wasn't just a tool. It was an entire ecosystem you carried in your pocket.
It felt inevitable, didn't it? Presented like it had always been waiting to exist, and now we were finally allowed to touch it.
A massive cultural shift followed. People checking phones everywhere, all the time.
Taking photos of food, texting instead of calling, tapping instead of talking.
How we related to information, to each other, even to boredom. It changed permanently.
Jobs didn't just launch a product, he subtly reprogrammed our behavior.
Even that swipe to unlock gesture became instinctive. People tried it on screens that weren't touchscreens.
The iPhone wasn't an accessory anymore, it was a new reflex.
And when the App Store launched in 2008, Apple's control, its ecosystem, just deepened. The iPhone became a platform, a passport, a playground, maybe a prison for some.
Jobs saw it coming, didn't seem to flinch. The success was just colossal.
Apple's stock soared. Competitors scrambled frantically. The whole tech world pivoted from the desktop to the palm.
But the deeper change was cultural. Jobs hadn't just made the phone smart, he'd made it intensely personal.
That was the real revolution, beyond the design or the profits.
The iPhone redefined Apple, and Steve Jobs, already a legend, became the man who didn't just see the future, he handed it to us, and we took it gladly.
He didn't just want to build the future. It felt like he wanted to own every single part of it.
After the iPhone, Apple's climb was just vertical. Revenue exploded, the iPod faded, but who cared? The iPhone was everything.
It wasn't just a product anymore, it was the platform. It consumed music players, GPS devices, cameras, maps, photo albums, notepads, wristwatches, wallets, and yeah, the phone itself.
And behind it all, still Jobs. Reviewing every detail, fighting over fonts, firing people on instinct.
The iPhone had to feel inevitable, seamless. And to achieve that, Apple built, owned, and controlled almost everything.
Hardware, software, services, retail. Jobs firmly rejected the open model of Android.
Apple would be closed, curated, a walled garden. You played by Apple's rules to get in.
And it worked. Commercially, Apple stores became these cathedrals of design. Customers lined up like pilgrims.
Each keynote was liturgy, each product drop a ritual. Jobs was both architect and the audience's avatar.
But inside Apple, the pressure must have been immense. The company was huge now. Teams ballooned, supply chains stretched across the globe.
Legal battles started piling up patents, App Store policies, questions about monopoly power.
And Jobs, still brilliant, was also becoming visibly exhausted. Still micromanaging ads, the exact shade of aluminum, how the box opened.
Obsessive, yes. Effective, often. But utterly unsustainable.
Around him, a new Apple was taking shape, more corporate, more secretive, more powerful than even he might have imagined back in the garage.
His control seemed complete, but something inside was fraying. Not in the company, but in him.
2003, the diagnosis, pancreatic cancer. He kept it quiet initially, refused surgery at first, tried alternative treatments.
Believed he could bend biology like he bent technology or design. It was the one system he could not engineer.
He gambled, delaying surgery for 9 months while trying diets, meditation, herbs, time he couldn't get back.
Finally had surgery, which seemed successful initially. But the cancer came back, silently, in his liver. Options narrowed.
He began to shrink physically. Still working, still presenting keynotes, but noticeably gaunt.
Cheekbones sharper, body receding, yet he insisted publicly, "I'm fine."
Always wore black, maybe trying to distract from the physical changes.
The Apple PR team tried to manage the story, stayed tight-lipped, but the rumors flew.
Shares would dip based on photos showing his weight loss or a canceled appearance. Investors wanted answers, fans wanted reassurance. Jobs gave neither.
"I want to focus on the work," and he did, intensely, during these incredibly difficult years from maybe 2006 to 2008.
He introduced the iPhone, the App Store, conceived the iPad. Amazing productivity under duress.
The man perhaps most afraid of death was furiously producing his legacy in real time, racing the clock.
Colleagues said he became gentler in some ways, more reflective. Still sharp, still intense, but maybe softened by the inevitable.
He started designing his exit as carefully as he designed a product.
Grooming Tim Cook as his successor, ensuring Jony Ive was at the heart of Apple's design future, trying to make the culture outlive his charisma.
Still working. 2009, took a 6-month medical leave, had a liver
Came
transplant.
back again, thinner, quieter, but present. Introduced the iPad in 2010, smiled for the cameras, but clearly fading.
By August 2011, he stepped down as CEO. His resignation letter was short, measured, inevitable.
I believe Apple's brightest and most innovative days are ahead of it. A final blessing, almost.
Not quite goodbye yet, but the final gesture of a man who knew the system was shutting down. Steve Jobs had always craved control. Now, finally, he was surrendering. But even his surrender felt precisely arranged.
The iPhone made so many things easier, didn't it? Navigating, communicating, filling empty moments, avoiding silence or stillness.
It flattened access to information in incredible ways, democratized photography, rewired how we think, walk, talk, work, shop, even sleep.
We gained almost everything, it feels like. But did we lose something, too? Something maybe we don't even have the words for?
Before the iPhone, maybe we reached outwards more. After, we started reaching downwards into pockets, toward screens.
Touching glass more often than the people around us sometimes. Swipe became a reflex. Scroll a pacifier. The screen, our primary lens on the world.
Jobs didn't invent addiction, obviously.
Yeah.
But he created this incredibly compelling device that turned human attention into its own architecture. And attention became the most valuable resource.
Was that his intention? Probably not. He wanted control, elegance, not chaos. He famously limited his own kids' screen time.
He believed in making tasteful, beautifully crafted tools to empower people.
But tools evolve once they leave the maker's hand, don't they? They belong to the world.
Apple created the elegant ecosystem, but others quickly filled it with notifications, endless feeds, dopamine loops. Designed for engagement, yes, but also distraction.
Not all bad, of course, but definitely not neutral. The world we touch every day is shaped by the design decisions he made years ago.
We live in this world of seamless convenience now. Instant answers, curated realities. It's efficient, often thrilling, but it also tethers us.
While we're scrolling through other people's lives, we're carrying the design language of one man's mind in our hands.
Jobs didn't just give us tools, he gave us his taste. A new posture, new habits, a new standard for what feels right, even if it's not always good for us.
That's his legacy, too. Not just the objects we hold, but how we hold them. How we now seem to hold everything.
He always believed he could outthink any problem, design his way out of anything. But some things, like biology, don't respond to design tweaks.
2003, that diagnosis of a rare pancreatic neuroendocrine tumor. Initially, the prognosis was actually better than typical pancreatic cancer. Treatable, potentially curable with surgery.
But Jobs, always the outlier, did what no doctor recommended. He delayed the surgery for 9 months.
Turned to diet, meditation, alternative therapies, fruit juices, acupuncture, herbs, fasting.
It wasn't necessarily disbelief in medicine, maybe, but perhaps an even stronger belief in his own intuition, his own ability to control his body through willpower and diet.
A gamble that cost him precious time. The tumor grew quietly while he pursued these alternatives.
He finally agreed to surgery, which was initially successful in removing the primary tumor.
But the cancer had likely already spread. It returned silently, metastasizing to his liver. Options became much narrower.
He began to shrink physically, visibly gaunt, especially in later appearances, but still working, still presenting keynotes.
Cheekbones sharper, body clearly frail, yet he insisted publicly, "I'm fine."
Always wore black. Maybe it helped camouflage the weight loss, kept the focus off his body.
Apple PR tried to manage the narrative, stayed intensely private about his health.
But the rumors swirled. Apple's stock price would fluctuate based on photos, canceled appearances.
Investors demanded clarity. Fans wanted reassurance. Jobs offered neither.
I want to focus on the work. And he did, with incredible intensity.
During these years, 2006 to 2008, while battling cancer, he oversaw the launch of the iPhone, the App Store, the initial concepts for the iPad.
The man arguably most afraid of death, or at least irrelevance, was furiously creating his legacy in real time, racing the clock.
People close to him said he became somewhat gentler, more reflective in this period, still sharp, still intense, but maybe softened by facing mortality.
He began to design his own exit strategy with the same care he put into products.
Grooming Tim Cook, ensuring Johnny Ive's design influence would continue, trying to embed the Apple culture so it could survive without his charismatic leadership.
Still pushing forward. 2009, that 6-month medical leave, the liver transplant.
And he returned again, thinner, quieter, but still there. Introduced the iPad in 2010, smiled, but you could see he was fading.
By August 2011, he knew it was time. Stepped down as CEO. The resignation letter was brief, dignified, inevitable.
I believe Apple's brightest and most innovative days are ahead of it, passing the torch.
Not quite the final goodbye, but the last official act of a man who knew his system was shutting down. Steve Jobs always wanted control. Now he was letting go. But even his surrender felt meticulously planned.
That Stanford commencement speech in 2005, it was remarkable. He didn't talk about market trends or profits. He just told 3 stories.
Felt like a blueprint for living, especially knowing what he was facing privately with his health, even then.
Stanford University, June 12, 2005. Dressed simply, black long-sleeve shirt, blue jeans.
15 minutes, 3 stories, no slides, no product reveals, just, well, truth.
Story 1, connecting the dots. Talked about dropping out of Reed College, sleeping on floors, returning Coke bottles for cash.
And taking that calligraphy class. Seemed totally useless at the time.
But years later, it directly shaped the beautiful typography on the first Macintosh. His point. You can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backward. Trust the process.
Story 2, love and loss. About building Apple and then being fired from it.
He called it devastating, public, humiliating. But then, that incredible perspective shift.
It turned out that getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have ever happened to me. It forced him to start over, rediscover curiosity.
Led him to start NXT, acquire Pixar, meet and fall in love with his wife, Laureen. The heaviness of being successful was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again.
Then, story 3, death. His voice changed, got tighter. He told them about the cancer diagnosis, how doctors initially gave him months to live.
Spoke so plainly, no drama, no ego, just the facts.
Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life. Powerful stuff.
Reminded the graduates that time is finite, that they're already naked, so there's no reason not to follow their heart.
And ended with that phrase he borrowed from the Whole Earth catalog. Stay hungry, stay foolish. It became his signature.
The audience applauded. He just nodded, stepped away, left the stage.
That speech became his most quoted, most studied address. Not because of what he built, but because of what he revealed about himself.
Beneath the genius, the rage, the vision there was a man looking death in the eye and finding focus, not fear.
He wasn't preaching, just quietly explaining why he worked so relentlessly, why he refused compromise, demanded so much. Because he always knew time runs out.
He didn't just plan for the end. It feels like he actively designed it, step by step, person by person, like a final product that had to ship on time.
In those final years, he was fighting on 2 fronts. The cancer eroding him physically, and the need to ensure Apple wouldn't erode culturally without him.
He knew time was short, but he also knew what intensely focused time could achieve.
Started pulling back from the big product launches, letting others take the stage more often.
Letting Tim Cook, the operations chief, step forward. Not with Jobs' flair, but with quiet competence.
Jobs didn't want a clone. He needed a caretaker.
Yeah.
Someone to protect the culture, the clarity, the values. Cook was that person.
Internally, he was deeply involved in planning Apple Campus 2, the spaceship. Obsessed over the materials, the curve of the glass, the flow of sunlight.
He knew he'd likely never work there, but it was like his architectural last will and testament. A structure designed to hold the company together after his body failed.
He also started reflecting more publicly, didn't he? Meeting with artists, writers, thinkers, speaking more softly in interviews, sharing lessons about purpose, not just profit.
Told his biographer, Walter Isaacson, I wanted my kids to know me. I wasn't always there for them, and I wanted them to understand why, and attempt to explain himself.
He never really became warm and fuzzy, not his style, but he did become more open in his own way.
Understood the power of the myth he'd created, knew he wouldn't outlive it physically, so he tried to leave something more human behind the legend.
October 5, 2011, Steve Jobs died at home, surrounded by family. He was 56.
His sister reported his final words were just,
Oh, wow. Oh, wow. Oh,
yeah.
wow. No explanation, no final command, just awe. The world mourned intensely. Tributes poured in from everywhere. Apples, flowers, candles, notes left at Apple stores globally.
Some people place tributes right next to their iPhones, like saying, you helped me connect, and now you're gone. A personal connection.
But Steve Jobs hadn't just vanished. He had prepared.
The product still reflected his aesthetic, the company still echoed his values, the world still used the tools he dreamed up.
His departure, like so much else in his life, felt engineered. Not to stop the machine, but to ensure it kept running smoothly without him at the helm.
He had always been the heartbeat of Apple, right?
Yeah.
Now the body had to keep moving without that specific pulse.
October 2011, Tim Cook takes over officially, the man of spreadsheets, supply chains, operations.
No dramatic stage presence,
Yeah.
no black turtleneck mystique. Not a product visionary in the Jobs mold, but precise, principled, incredibly prepared.
Which is exactly why Jobs chose him. He knew Apple needed stability and execution next.
Initially, everyone watched Apple holding their breath. Would the design falter? Would the magic erode? Would it lose its soul?
Instead, Apple grew massively under Cook, expanded globally, refined the product lines, launched huge new services. Apple Music, Pay, the watch.
Revenue soared, market cap exploded. First U.S. company to hit $1 trillion, then $2 trillion. By metrics, stronger than ever.
But something did change. Everyone felt it, even if it was hard to define.
Jobs was chaos and poetry. Cook is process and polish.
Under Jobs, products launched when they felt ready to astonish. Under Cook, they tend to arrive more predictably, on schedule.
Apple today feels cleaner, maybe safer, more overtly inclusive, definitely more corporate, some might say less haunted.
The company still talks about Jobs constantly, quotes on the walls, his name invoked in meetings, his instincts revered.
But make no mistake,
Yeah.
it's not Steve Jobs' Apple anymore. It's Apple built in his image, but now evolving beyond it.
New products have emerged, the watch, AirPods, the M1 chips, hugely successful. The design language remains minimal, elegant, refined.
But the storytelling has changed. Nobody ends a keynote with one more thing in quite the same way. There's no second Steve, Apple knows that.
What remains is his deep imprint. The curve of the glass, the invisible haptics, that core belief that the user should feel empowered, never lost.
But the wild, rebellious spirit feels quieter now, more mature, more measured.
Not necessarily worse, just different. Like a cathedral after the visionary architect is buried beneath it. Still magnificent, but the energy has shifted.
Apple without Steve Jobs is a company perhaps more at peace. And that peace, for some, signifies health and stability. For others, it marks the end of an era of truly revolutionary leaps.
He spent his life trying to control his image, the narrative. In death, we've almost made him simpler than he ever actually was.
The world didn't just mourn, it almost canonized him. Headlines read like scripture.
Apple stores became shrines. Flowers, candles, notes. Some people left bitten apples. Some just stood silently, holding the devices he created.
Biographies rushed out, documentaries followed, feature films tried, and often struggled to capture his contradictions.
But more than just the facts, this feeling took hold. He fundamentally changed what we expect from technology, and maybe even from ourselves.
He became shorthand for genius. His quotes popped up in business meetings, taped to laptops. Startups named themselves after his keynote phrases.
Stay hungry, stay foolish. It became almost a prayer for innovators.
But as the myth grew, the actual man sometimes shrank. People conveniently forgot the cruelty, the volatility, the broken relationships, the outbursts, the colleagues fired abruptly, the daughter he initially denied.
Or worse, sometimes those flaws were romanticized. Oh, that's just what greatness looks like.
But Steve Jobs wasn't simple. He wasn't always right. He certainly wasn't a prophet.
He was a flawed, brilliant, often brutal human being with this obsessive desire to make perfect things, perhaps because he never felt quite perfect or complete himself.
In our remembering, we've often smoothed over those rough edges. We turned his silence into wisdom, his sharpness into leadership, his pain into clarity.
We created a version of Jobs that maybe even he wouldn't fully recognize.
Perhaps the final irony is this. The man who reduced complexity to elegance has now been elegantly reduced himself.
To a quote, a stage presence, a turtleneck, a glowing screen. And that phrase that means something slightly different every time you hear it. One more thing.
The man himself is gone. The myth absolutely remains, but somewhere in the spaces between them, something undeniably human still flickers.
Right. Since his death, he's been studied, copied, criticized, sanctified. Some see him as a martyr for innovation, others as a cautionary tale about leadership.
Some CEOs try to mimic his bluntness, forgetting the brilliance had to come first.
His influence is truly everywhere in every glowing screen, every device we reach for instinctively. His design fingerprints are all over our daily rituals.
But the people who knew him best, they rarely describe an easy or simple genius.
They talk about someone emotionally raw, fiercely intuitive, capable of being both incredibly cruel and surprisingly generous, restless, endlessly curious, and maybe deeply afraid of becoming irrelevant.
A man who burned through ideas, through people, through time itself.
Beneath the confidence, the turtleneck, the minimalism, there was this soul that just never seemed to settle.
Jobs didn't necessarily want to be liked. He desperately wanted to be right.
Wanted the world to conform to the vision inside his head. And when it didn't, he kept working, iterating, stripping away until the product, and sometimes the people involved, were as close to his version of truth as possible.
Was he a genius? Yes, absolutely. But not the clean, easy kind. The kind that leaves some wreckage alongside the temples. The kind that creates tension as much as triumph. The kind that makes ordinary things feel like the future just tapped you on the shoulder.
Is he a ghost now? In a way, yes. Still here in the rhythm of the screen, the curve of the keyboard, the satisfying silence after a piece of perfect design just works.
He haunts what we expect from technology and maybe what we expect from ourselves.
Steve Jobs didn't make the world perfect. He made it more intimate, more connected, and perhaps more demanding of our attention.
He didn't necessarily make us better people, but he gave us these incredibly powerful tools to discover more about who we were and who we could become.
Genius or ghost? I suppose it depends on what you see, what you feel, when the screen finally goes dark.
Steve Jobs once said, pretty bluntly, "We're here to put a dent in the universe."
Looking back, what he left wasn't just a dent, was it? It feels more like a language, a shape, a feeling.
Yeah, that feeling of technology almost disappearing into your hand, becoming part of how you live, work, love, dream.
So this hasn't really been a eulogy, more like trying to capture an echo.
He gave us tools, yes, but maybe more than that. He gave us a way to feel a little less alone in this world of glass and code.
Steve Jobs is gone, but every swipe, every scroll, every pinch to zoom. It's him, isn't it? In the simplicity, the silence, the thing that just works.
He didn't leave a final manifesto or a holy book or a gray museum. He left interfaces.
And in those interfaces, there's intuition. And in that intuition, there's a belief.
A belief that technology should invite you in, not intimidate you. That complexity should never be an excuse for bad design. That beauty can be a form of clarity. That design, ultimately, is about dignity.
There won't be another Steve Jobs. The world probably doesn't need another one.
What it needs, maybe, is what he reminded us of. That the people who obsess, who edit, who simplify, who truly care about the details, they're the ones who shape how we see ourselves. Not louder, but clearer.
In the end, maybe it wasn't just the iPhone, but the underlying idea that a device could somehow vanish, leaving you just with your thoughts, your work, your music, your voice.
Jobs always said something like, make something wonderful and put it out into the world. You'll be surprised how far it goes.
He did, and it went farther, much farther than perhaps even he could have imagined, and still, it keeps going.